Delayed attacks is something I've had a serious problem with ever since the launch of Elden Ring base game, and it has only persisted, arguably getting worse with the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC. But up until now, I'm not sure if I could put it into words why I thought it was a design flaw. But I think I finally figured out how to express this, and how to draw the line when it's fine, or even done well, and when it's excessive padding to add cheap difficulty to a boss fight. Before the actually crowd gets here, let's define what I mean with delayed attacks very clearly. What I'm talking about when I'm referring to a delayed attack is when an enemy or boss starts readying an incoming attack, but deliberately hold it in place to bait you to roll earlier than you need to dodge it, and then they lose the attack to punish your panic roll, oftentimes being a very snappy or fast animation for that final swing, so you can't do another dodge to make up for the first one. Sometimes the enemy or boss will hold it for a comically long time, simply so you have no earthly idea when it's supposed to happen and encourage more panicking. This is different from an attack that is slow but very clearly telegraphed, and is still very manageable to just roll or avoid on sight. At face value, it can certainly be hard to distinguish, but oftentimes the boss in itself is slow and calculated, so the design of the enemy can be a good way to telegraph if a boss will have fast or slow moves. But in Elden Ring, even the most massive bosses can move at speeds that should be unfathomable, but also, of course, have their fair share of delayed attacks to throw you off. This specific detail of the sizes of boss design will be a key point in my next video I'm planning on as well, if you think you'd be interested in that. Now that that's been established, let's take a look at some of the examples of the history of delayed attacks in prior Souls games, because of course, they didn't start in Elden Ring. In the first 3 Souls games, some examples of bosses that have explicitly delayed attacks are Penetrator in Demon Souls, Iron Golem in Dark Souls 1, and Smelter Demon in Dark Souls 2. Both of them. Penetrator has a lot of attacks that could be considered the traditional delayed attack. Its main attack is somewhat different in that it's a feint in the first swing, followed by the actual swing, but it still acts in a similar way functionally. He's also quite fast in his actual swings, so it constitutes that too. There's also the follow-up to that attack, and it's even more explicit in the grab attack, which has him hold the attack for almost a perfect amount for you to panic dodge and then grab you. However, this all feels like an intentional design consideration for the boss fight. Having a knight do feints or baits while in sword combat is very natural, having more finesse and strategy than a lot of demons you fight in the game so far. Because as far as I recall, there's no other boss that has such explicit delays, just the occasional slow and telegraphed bosses as I mentioned earlier, examples being Tower Knight and Adjudicator, where as long as you're paying attention, there's almost no shot that you'll get baited by an attack, and can often simply be spaced out instead of dodged. Dark Souls has a few bosses with delays that could count, but I mainly want to look at Iron Golem to show 2 points. 1, most of the attacks on this guy are also the slow and telegraphed, once again shown by the visual design of the boss. And 2, the one extremely delayed attack it has is also a grab attack. You find that for a lot of these early games, the delayed attacks are reserved for a grab attack, which that in itself is a clever way to differentiate them from the rest of the moveset. Grabs can have an additional danger where you could be at risk of being knocked off in an arena, so spatial awareness while that attack happens is another factor to take into account while fighting bosses. For the last example, there's the Smelter Demons. I don't play Dark Souls too often, so I could certainly be forgetting how common delays are in the base game, but a lot of the bosses tend to be on the slower end, and I feel like the Smelter Demons are pretty much built as a boss with delayed attacks, similar to Penetrator. And not only that, the delays vary per each variant of the boss. I know that in a lot of cases, Smelter isn't people's favorite boss, but it's certainly distinguished by this, and it's far from being an overused mechanic. 2 other Dark Souls 2 examples I want to bring up are the most notorious DLC bosses, Fume Knight and Sur Alone. Fume Knight is a very clever use of the delayed attacks because he has 2 swords, one thinner and one massive. The thinner one is a faster one as you can expect, but the big one is the interesting one. As far as I can tell, this is the only sword that will have delayed attacks, and it makes sense with the design. Wielding a giant sword like this with one hand would be a little more sluggish. When it comes to phase 2, a good chunk of the attacks will still have an aspect of delay, albeit maybe a bit faster swings, but now he's two-handing it, so it's feasible that he'll be able to swing it faster than before. Sur Alone has a plethora of delayed aspects in its fight, but I find it similar to the Penetrator, and that being an experienced swordsman, it would make sense that the fighting style might be the kind that reflects a warrior that would use feints to throw off an opponent. Whether you think the animations are janky or not is another story entirely, not really for the scope of this video, but I hope the idea I'm proposing is coming across. So these 2 are yet more examples of where the delayed attacks are reflected by the visual design, allowing for some degree of telegraphing, or at the very least make sense with the design. But only 2 years later, things started getting a little shaky. So by the time of Dark Souls 3, it felt like the delayed attack started to become a little more normalized, but maybe in ways that didn't feel as well thought out. The first example I want to look at is Pontiff Sullivan. His design is somewhat similar to Fume Knight in that he has a bigger and smaller sword, but the difference might as well be negligible, because he swings both of them at the speed of straight swords, a dagger. It doesn't matter, it's excessive. This aspect alone is one I always disliked about Pontiff, and hell, even Gwen in Dark Souls 1. But on top of that, this guy is definitely prone to doing delayed attacks. Now I think the detail that makes this go from a negligible aspect of the boss and start steering it to tedium is that the boss can combo. A lot. It can combo into straightforward attacks that you can dodge on reaction, it can combo into more delayed attacks, and it doesn't stop very much, until it feels like it. And of course, there's that one full combo attack that pretty much exhausts your entire stamina bar, with a whole mix of both delays and non-delayed attacks, which overall makes it a lot more difficult to keep track of what is what, especially with the dual sword setup. In a lot of ways, it definitely feels like a proto Elden Ring boss fight for reasons like this, and as you can probably tell, it's certainly not my favorite design philosophy. The next example is maybe a more positive one, with the Dancer. Thankfully this one feels like it had more consideration for the delayed attack style in its boss design, just like some of the better examples in the previous games, with the whole dancing motif. But even without that, these do feel a little more graceful to me because it's not as snappy, with the animations being more smooth. In contrast, the grab attack for the Dancer is not really a delayed attack, it's a little bit consistent all the way through, although admittedly with slightly questionable hitboxes at times. But overall, this one felt more passable to me than Pontiff in a lot of regards. But now to the last example, Nameless King. The first phase does have delayed attacks, but the attack pool from Nameless himself isn't very large, so it's easy to identify and dodge those. Obviously the main talking points here will be in phase 2. Let's just say it how it is, this is indeed a delay fest. Nearly every attack is a delayed attack in some way, but I do believe there's a few aspects of it that make it a little bit more manageable and a better experience than Pontiff at the very least. If you were to design a boss with delayed attacks, I do think a longer weapon model that does have to travel a fair horizontal distance and isn't excessively fast is probably about the best type of weapon you can have for this kind of attack. The polearm weapon design allows for more telegraph because of how much ground it needs to cover for the hitbox to reach you, and it's the reason you won't see Moog covered later on in this video, because although he has a fair amount of delayed attacks, it still feels a fair bit more natural than some of the other examples. Although admittedly they can still be annoying when you start learning the fight and understanding that delays won't be as brutal. As a sort of example, although I don't think a boss like this exists, probably for good reason, imagine trying to fight a thrusting attack boss with a mix of delayed attacks and normal attacks. Thrust weapons are already a little awkward to read in general because of how subtle the movement is, so it'd be a nightmare in a situation like this. Any boss that already exists, that has a weapon like a spear, generally has a lot of telegraphing to their attacks, instead of just poking you directly. I think if you played any amount of PvP, you probably know how obnoxious thrusting weapons can be. But anyway, this, alongside the fact that I find all the attacks from Nameless King being very distinct, do give it some leeway in this department. Ultimately, I think that the delays in Dark Souls 3 are starting to show flaws, but aren't an issue across the board quite yet. However, that's sort of the problem. When something starts to rear its ugly head, if you don't nip it in the bud, it can manifest into something worse. In Elden Ring, it feels like the delayed attacks started to become almost a default crutch to making boss fights harder on first encounter, and it's apparent really fast after one of the bosses you're likely to encounter first, Margit. Now, I'll be generous and say that there's some value in an early boss teaching you lessons. So in this case, the idea that you shouldn't panic roll as soon as you see a boss winding back for an attack. But one, I'm not entirely sure that having the delayed attack be as snappy as it is necessarily conducive to that either. It essentially tells you, yeah, you're not going to learn these attacks by reacting. You have to memorize the entire pattern. And two, did nearly every attack have to be a delayed one? And let's be real, I think Margit to be the harder boss than even Godric, due to him having a plethora of attacks that kind of blend together, so it's more difficult to tell them apart. While Godric, who obviously also has its fair share of delayed attacks as well, at the very least has some more distinguished animations. For another comparison that might help paint a better picture for anyone who's struggled with them too, think of Elemer or the Bell-Bearing Hunters. The attacks that launch the sword, there's 2 or 3 variants of that attack that are almost indistinguishable from each other. Like, trust me, I've tried to learn the difference, but there's certainly at least 2 variants of it that I couldn't tell apart in the middle of combat. And one of them has a delay, and one is instant. And a few attacks from Margit feel in the same vein sometimes. even if not as extreme. And why? Because they are mostly just standard attacks from his cane, and he will combo a lot of them together, so it's hard to know when the combo starts and ends for punishing back a lot of the time. So I mainly just end up finding it a boss design that muddies the waters a lot due to having such a variance on how you time or react to most of the attacks. I mean, hell, there's even a whole ass animation picking fun at the delayed attacks Margit has, and it's some of the best laughs I've had at some of these, because it's true. Oh, look at that, it's been 2 years since that's been posted. Congrats. This one attack they're depicting, although being an exaggeration, is not even that far off. If you move a certain way during one of his attacks, he will hold it for such a stupidly long time as it's trying to track you. And yeah, obviously this won't happen all the time, but if someone just happens to be strafing, which is very reasonable, they may just have this happen. So I gotta say, right off the bat, not a great first impression. I didn't enjoy that aspect of Margit or Godric in my first playthrough, even though I've come to not mind it as much as I got used to it later on. The next main example I want to look at is Star Scorched Radahn. Obviously this guy has a lot of delays that fall into my definition. You probably already knew that. But I want to take a moment to bring back the argument of the slow and telegraphed differentiations. I mean, the second part of that is already kind of off the table. He'll just swing when he wants to let loose. But what about the first one? He's a big boss, so it would kind of make him fall into the slow category with the visual design, right? Does this look like a slow boss to you? And yes, I know, he has the whole gravity magic thing, so lore-wise it makes sense. But what exactly telegraphs that about his design on our first encounter? Let's say the only thing you see about Radahn is the festival starting and watching that cutscene about Radahn. There's nothing about it that points that he has power over gravity, and the whole theming of stars don't allude to that either. Like sure, we all know that in the lore of the game, we associate stars and gravity together to some degree, but from a first play perspective, that's not obvious. Stars aren't meteors after all. It is simply interchangeable for people seeing this from a more medieval style of time frame. Now if you do learn about him in the lore, you could find hints to this, and that's great. My argument isn't exactly that it's unfair, just that the slow and telegraphed visual design doesn't quite apply or justify too well with this guy. And to be honest, neither is it with Margit or Godric. They both can be surprisingly agile. The last main boss I want to look at for the base game is Radagon, which is always one that irked me as well, because not only does he have delayed attacks, he also has very precise dodge timings that you need to do because there's a second layer of delay with the holy magic that comes from some of his strikes hitting the ground. Now yes, you could make the argument that this is a valid way to expand the delayed attack and increase the difficulty, given it's a final boss, and it's in line with what the game has given expectations for so far. And sure, that's true. But the thing that makes it more frustrating, I think, is just how aggressive Radagon is on top of that, especially when it comes to heal punishing in the later stages of the fight. So it just feels like a panic party trying to recover from being low health to getting back to full. And as I've alluded to before with Pontiff, a lot of times the issue is that bosses in Elden Ring will have an overwhelming amount of both incredibly fast, aggressive attacks and delayed attacks. So oftentimes the only possible way to dodge on the first X amount of attempts is just a panic roll, until you start to recognize and memorize attacks. But on a boss like Rellana, it can take a while to be able to make sense of all the different attack animations, especially when the combos last for a long time. And especially when sometimes they can chain combos in close succession. Since we mentioned Rellana now, it's time to address the most recent thing that I think took it over the edge, Shadow of the Erdtree DLC. So far, I focused on the main story bosses to talk about for the base game, minus Elemer, but there's even more I left out so far, like God-Devouring Serpent, Beast Clergyman, Godfrey. Melania of course has some, but it's not as egregious. She has her own issues. That's a pretty hefty list of main bosses that have a noteworthy amount of delayed attacks infesting the fight. But now if we look at the DLC, oh boy. Dancing Lion, Rellana, Piercing Knight, Commander Gaius, Scattered Tree Avatar, Matir, Midra, Bale, the second Radahn, sharing problems with Radagon when there's often 2 layers of delayed attacks. Honestly, I almost entirely listed the main boss catalog. The only ones I could exclude in good conscience were Mesmer, because his use was very sparing, and it was one of the best bosses in the DLC, and maybe Romina, which might still have some, but it didn't feel nearly as excessive or abused to me. And it should be noted that she also has a polearm style weapon. I think it's gotten so bad that bosses like Midra have become almost entirely a fight of delayed attacks, and almost nothing else. So much so that it's nearly backfired. This mechanic that's used to add some difficulty to reading bosses wrapped back around to making the boss easier, because once you know that nearly every attack will be a delay, it's become predictable, which I think is the big takeaway here. This style of attack has become completely overdone and predictable. It's tiring, and it's lost all the nuance it might have once had. It's like the boss second phase thing. There was a period in time where a boss having a second phase could have been a real mix-up and throw you off and surprise you. But tell me any main boss in the DLC that didn't have a second phase. No matter how much or how little it changed the actual fight, you could almost bet any major fight had a second phase of some sort. It's become part of a formula, when both of these two aspects were supposed to be a mix-up, or a surprise, to teach you something. I've gone on record saying that I do not like Midra almost at all. I know that's an unpopular opinion by now, and one of the major things that people tell me is that, oh, but it actually feels like a Dark Souls boss. I thought you'd like it for that reason. And I completely disagree. Even the people who state that are referring to Dark Souls 3 in particular, even that game still used the late attacks somewhat sparingly. Only a few bosses felt like it predominantly used that playstyle, and by the point you are likely to find Midra, the whole DLC and a good chunk of the base game are riddled by that already as is, so it didn't feel like anything new to me. And that's certainly disappointing when this is the first and only Frenzy themed boss in the entirety of Elden Ring. It could have easily been something more special. That's not to say his animation and grace aren't beautiful in their own right, but that's not enough to sell me at this point. The cherry on top of all this is that this excessive amount of delayed attacks also extend to just regular enemies, especially the stronger ones, in both the base game of Elden Ring and the DLC. So it has become a chore to learn even repeating enemies in the overworld. The Omen, Crucible Knights, Lion Guardians, Finger Creepers, Scaly Misbegottens. I mean, look at this. And from the DLC, the Golem Smith, the Curse Blades, Demi-Human Swordsman, Horned Warriors, Fire Knight, and the list just goes on and on. It just infiltrates every corner of the game, that it's inevitable to feel like this will only continue to be the case for these styles of games going forward, and that's truly concerning. I think ultimately the problem here is that they clearly do this in an attempt to make the boss fights and such harder, and not as easily cleared in first or few attempts, which I think is a misguided design philosophy. Following this thought process, I don't find much different to how the design philosophy of Dark Souls 2 seemed to assume that the main reason people played their games at the time was that they just wanted a hard game, instead of a challenging but fair experience. On a personal level, what I look for in a boss fight is a fair challenge, a unique experience, and or a fun fight in general. And the abundance of delayed attacks as of late certainly don't meet the last two. And maybe for some, arguably the first one either. But I wouldn't go as far as to say that it's outright unfair most of the time. Just repetitive and mundane at this point. That's not to say you can't like them or enjoy them, but you have to admit that it's being way overdone in this game. I'd be much more tolerant to them if they were more selective with which and how many delayed attacks they gave each boss. As it stands now, it's starting to become the norm, and it's becoming old, fast. Admittedly, my preferred playstyle is an aggressive one, so it doesn't allow me to be aggressive in the way I like to on early encounters, until I learn the moveset of the boss properly. But that in itself isn't unique or special. That'll be the case for any boss, delayed attack or not. The delays on their own don't make a boss fight interesting, just more tedious to learn in my opinion. But if you recall me mentioning nipping things in the bud, I think that's something a lot of fans need to realize. No matter how much you like a game, it can, and likely does, have flaws. You can ignore the flaws if you wish, but if they're not called out or addressed, it's very possible that they only worsen as time goes on. It certainly strayed really far from how the original games designed it, and I would dare to say that if something was done one way on the original design philosophy, there probably was a good reason for it, and it might have been lost by now. But I certainly don't like this toxic mentality that likely newer fans to something always seem to have. That criticizing something just means you don't like something, or you have an agenda from or towards it, or that it's just not for you and you should hold your tongue on it. I feel like most of us in this space probably have and will learn this lesson eventually at the very least, but you can criticize something you love. I'm certain a lot of us do because we love the FromSoft games and want them to do better, but the more the games sell, the more they can neglect issues if people just mindlessly consume it without putting any critical thinking into it. I've already put in my 2 cents that I might be holding off on the next FromSoft game in this style unless I see it improving when seeing actual gameplay. But I wish I didn't feel like I was put in that spot. Alright, that's all for the video. I don't know how common of complaint this is overall. I do know some people agree that this is definitely getting, at the very least, overdone. Whether they think it's a bad design flaw or not, I guess it's up to them individually. But it's something I've noticed to some degree as early as Dark Souls 3, but definitely by Elden Ring. Anyway, I teased that the next video had to do with big visual boss designs, And that's because we're going to be talking about the camera bosses, so to speak. The bosses that really just mess with your camera as you're fighting them. At least that's the main topic of the video. It'll be similar to this one in that we discuss how it's been done right in the past and how it's started to become a little bit of an issue here and there. So that should be next video, almost entirely sure about that. After that, I'll probably also talk about the hidden health bars issue, if you can call it that for some people. Even though it's a topic I've been wanting to talk for a long time, it's not necessarily as pressing because it's not a big focus on the DLC or even Elden Ring. It was kind of rare, which we'll get to, of course, in that video. But it is something I've been wanting to talk for a long time. So yeah, that'll be my projected plan for the next couple weeks. But if you want to see any of the coming up videos, do consider subscribing. I have had some other critiques of both the DLC and the base game with some specific topics. You can see those now. Thank you to the members that are currently supporting the channel. I appreciate you. And yeah, for anyone new or returning to my channel, thank you for watching. I hope to see you again. So see you in the next one. Bye-bye.